And now the moment you've all been waiting for. Another exciting episode of So That's It, is it?
There's a bunch of different subgenres, if you will, of propaganda. There's white propaganda, gray propaganda, black propaganda. There's
Oh, right,
bunch
yeah.
Yeah. And when you read that, you're like, holy crap.
I'm sure there's plaid propaganda.
No. I mean, that's yeah.
Well,
but
probably for
if
the Scottish National Party.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we often think that propaganda is just, posters and articles in the newspaper or whatever. But actually, I almost like to think sometimes that the mind itself, or people's brains, are the best propagandists, or are their own propagandists. And what I mean by that is, studies have been done, and I could cite the links or whatever when we post this. But studies have been done that show that the mind is not necessarily elastic, but it is rather plastic. And the difference is that, if a mind is elastic, or if the brain is elastic, then the synapses that we use to think with will move into a certain direction and then snap back to our normal way of thinking. And that's actually not how the mind is. That the mind is actually plastic, and what that means is that if we think in certain ways, the mind will, the plasticity of our brain synapses will accommodate those thoughts. And then the brain synapses are plastic in the sense that they will kind of contour themselves along the channels of those thoughts and not snap back to some prior way of thinking, but rather stick, like as if it were being shaped or molded by plastic, stay in those channels of thought. So in other words, my point is that when you're thinking, you often reinforce those thoughts, and so that it becomes pleasurable for you to continue to think in the ways that you are used to thinking. And so let's say I'm a jazz fan, citing my brother who's a Utah jazz fan.
I thought you meant jazz, like the music that people
or music, but like just keep it strictly basketball. So if I'm just a jazz fan, my mind will associate mountains and the color purple and white, jazz colors, and certain things with pleasurable sensations, because my mind is used to associating those things with pleasure. And of course it will literally hurt my brain in a synaptical level to think in terms of being a Trailblazers fan or a Spurs fan, because my mind is used to, it has channels carved out in my synapses that accommodate jazz fandom. And if I suddenly become or think in terms of being a Spurs fan, my brain doesn't have the same kind of pleasurable response from, switching from, what is normally pleasurable for me, being a jazz fan, to suddenly being a Spurs fan. The mind itself will kind of fight that. And the reason I'm making this kind of extended analogy or whatever is because I think that, human beings almost inherently propagandize their own ideas that they hold. So it's very hard for them to think outside of the box, or think in terms of some other way of thinking. So, and of course, this all works with politics too. Like a lot of people they're raised as staunch Democrats or staunch Republicans, left or right, and they're used to the Democratic talking points or the Republican talking points that they agree with on both sides, and it hurts their brain to kind of think outside of those prescribed synaptical kind of responses.
I would even go one step further. If you took, say, Dennis Kucinich, right, and Ron Paul, which agree on a lot of things, they both agree, and you switch their R&Ds, right, and all of a sudden Ron Paul's a Democrat and Kucinich is a Republican, right? I think then the Republicans would be like, oh, well, Kucinich knows what he's talking about because he's, it's just switching that D and the R. You know, it's like, oh, he's on our team. So anyway, what did we learn today? We learned that propaganda, it just is a lazy way of reinforcing, you know, stuff that you already choose to believe anyway. You know.
Exactly. Yeah.